María Elena Vásquez held the gold ring between trembling fingers, feeling the weight of 3 generations of women who had worn it before her. The dim light of the table lamp made the wedding band shimmer against her calloused skin, each scratch telling a story she could no longer afford to preserve. At 2 in the morning, while her 3 children slept in the apartment's single bedroom in El Paso, she calculated for the 100th time numbers that simply wouldn't add up. $400 in overdue rent, $50 worth of food in the nearly empty refrigerator, $30 in her pocket. The yellow eviction notice stuck to the door like a permanent scar, reminding her that in 72 hours they would be on the street. Maria closed her eyes and listened to the familiar sound of diesel trucks passing on the highway, carrying American dreams to places she could never reach. "Mommy, are you crying?" Sophia's voice cut through the silence. At 12 years old, her eldest daughter carried responsibilities on her shoulders that no child should know. Always alert, always worried, always translating not just words between English and Spanish, but also the fears that Maria tried to hide. "No, mija, I'm just tired." Maria quickly hid the ring under the bills scattered across the table. Electric, water, groceries, pharmacy bills for Diego's inhaler, red numbers screaming that there was no more time for miracles. "Go back to bed," Sophia approached, her bare feet making small sounds on the cold linoleum. "I heard Mrs. Patterson yelling in the hallway today. She said ugly words about us." Her brown eyes, so similar to those of the husband Maria had lost in a construction accident 2 years ago, reflected premature wisdom. "Can we go to Abuela's house in Mexico?" The question pierced Maria's heart like a needle. How could she explain to a 12-year-old that going back meant accepting defeat, that crossing the border again would be impossible? That Abuela's house was just a golden memory that couldn't feed 3 children or pay for the education Sophia deserved. "We can't, amor. This is our home now." The words came out firmer than she felt. Maria stood and hugged her daughter, feeling how much she had grown in recent months, how hunger had thinned her small arms. "Everything will be okay." But as Sophia returned to the bedroom, Maria looked at the ring again. Her grandmother had survived the Mexican Revolution with this wedding band. Her mother had endured extreme poverty without selling it. And now she, María Elena Vásquez, would be the first to break it. Tomorrow morning, before the children woke up, she would walk to Doña Carmen's house, swallowing her pride along with her tears, and transform love into dollars. The sound of Diego coughing in the next room brought her back to brutal reality. Her 8-year-old son needed a new inhaler, and the pharmacy didn't accept promises or old jewelry as payment. Maria kissed the ring one last time, whispering a prayer her grandmother had taught her, and carefully placed it in the small velvet box that held her family treasures. For now, it was still hers. For a few more hours, she could still pretend she wouldn't be the woman who sold her family's soul for survival. The morning air carried the scent of fresh tortillas and diesel fumes as Maria walked down Alameda Street, her grandmother's wedding ring burning like a coal in her coat pocket. Each step toward Doña Carmen's house felt like walking away from everything she had promised to protect. The neighborhood was already alive with the sounds of survival. Children playing in dusty yards, mothers hanging laundry on fire escapes, men gathering at the corner store before heading to construction sites that might or might not have work. Doña Carmen's house stood out like a gold tooth in a weathered smile. Fresh paint, iron security bars polished to a shine, and a small hand-painted sign that read, "We buy gold, compramos oro," in faded red letters. Maria had walked past this house hundreds of times, always promising herself she would never need to knock on that door. Today, necessity had made her a liar to her own dreams. The old woman who answered wore thick glasses and a suspicious frown that seemed permanently etched into her face. Doña Carmen had buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had learned to survive by understanding exactly what desperation looked like. "María Elena, right? You clean the offices downtown." It wasn't a question. In neighborhoods like theirs, everyone knew everyone's business, struggles, and shame. What brings you to my door so early?" Maria's throat felt like sandpaper. She pulled out the small velvet box with trembling hands, opening it to reveal the ring that had witnessed a century of tears, joy, and survival. The gold caught the morning light, seeming to pulse with its own heartbeat. "I need to sell this." The words came out as a whisper, as if speaking them louder would make the betrayal more real. Doña Carmen took the box without ceremony, pulling out a jeweler's loupe and examining the ring with the methodical precision of someone who had seen thousands of desperate people trade their past for their future. She turned it over in her weathered fingers, checking the stamp, testing the weight, calculating value against desperation. 14 carat, maybe 2 grams. It's old, but the craftsmanship is good. She set the ring down on her kitchen table between them like evidence in a trial. "I can give you $150. Maria felt the air leave her lungs. $150. The ring her great-grandmother had saved money for 3 years to buy. The ring that had traveled across borders, survived revolutions, and represented everything her family had built and lost and built again. $150 wouldn't even cover half the overdue rent. But it's worth much more than that, the gold alone. Maria's voice cracked, revealing the desperation she had tried to hide. The gold is worth what I can sell it for, minus what I need to survive. Doña Carmen's voice wasn't cruel, just honest in the way that poverty taught people to be. This isn't Joyeria El Palacio downtown. This is reality. Take it or leave it. Maria stared at the ring sitting on the scratched wooden table. In her mind, she could see Sophia's thin face, Diego's wheezing chest, little Carmen asking why there was no milk for her cereal. She could hear Mrs. Patterson's threats echoing in the hallway, feel the weight of bills that grew heavier each day like stones in her pockets. "Can you do 200? The words escaped before she could stop them, and immediately she felt smaller, like she was begging for scraps when she had once been proud. Doña Carmen studied her for a long moment, seeing something in Maria's eyes that perhaps reminded her of her own younger, desperate self. 175, final offer. And I'll throw in some advice. Whatever's driving you to sell this ring, find another way, because once it's gone forever. But Maria was already nodding, already reaching for the money, already becoming the woman she had sworn she would never be. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself standing in the same spot, staring at the empty velvet box that had once held her mother's pearl earrings. The $175 from the wedding ring had bought groceries, Diego's inhaler, and bought them exactly 18 days of breathing room before the bills crashed down again like a house of cards in a desert wind. Mrs. Patterson had accepted the partial rent payment with the enthusiasm of a vulture picking at roadkill, making it clear that this was temporary mercy, not forgiveness. The pearl earrings had been next, then her father's silver watch. Each piece of her family's history transformed into temporary solutions that felt more like bandages on a severed artery. Maria was learning the mathematics of desperation. Heritage divided by necessity equals survival, but the equation never balanced. "Mummy, there's a boy at church who says he can help us." Sophia's voice interrupted her mother's dark calculations. Sunday Mass at St. Joseph's had become their weekly anchor, the one place where they could sit without anyone asking for money, where Father Miguel's gentle sermons reminded them that God saw their struggles even when neighbors looked away. "What kind of help, mija?" Maria asked, though she had learned to be suspicious of help that came from strangers. In their world, help usually came with hidden costs that revealed themselves when you could least afford to pay them. "His name is Alex. He's young, maybe 20-something. He speaks Spanish, but he's from here, you know. He says he knows about computers and money and things that can help families like us." Sophia's eyes held that spark of hope that Maria both treasured and feared. Hope was dangerous when you had so little left to lose. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep to the sound of police sirens and late-night traffic, Maria sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the ghosts of sold jewelry and the harsh reality of remaining bills. She thought about her grandmother's stories of the revolution, how families had buried gold in the desert and lost everything when they couldn't remember where they had hidden their treasures, how paper money had become worthless overnight, and only those who understood the new rules survived. The knock on her door came at 9 o'clock, soft but insistent. Through the peephole, she saw a young man with kind eyes and nervous hands holding what looked like a small computer. Behind him stood Father Miguel, whose presence immediately calmed her fears. The priest would never bring danger to her doorstep. "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm Alex Rivera. Sophia mentioned you might be interested in learning about alternative ways to protect your family's financial future." His Spanish was perfect, but carried the accent of someone who had been born speaking 2 languages. He looked like the kind of young man who fixed computers at the community center and helped elderly neighbors set up their phones. Maria opened the door wider, noting how Alex's clothes were clean but not expensive, how he carried himself with the confidence of education but not the arrogance of privilege. Father Miguel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maria, Alex has been helping several families in the parish. What he shares might sound strange at first, but I've seen the results. The Gonzalez family, the Hernandezes, they're sleeping better at night now." Alex pulled out what Maria now recognized as a laptop computer, the kind Sophia used at school but could never afford at home. "Mrs. Vasquez, what if I told you there was a way to store money that no government could touch, no bank could freeze, no landlord could demand? Something that could grow in value while you sleep and travel with you anywhere in the world with just a string of words you memorize." Maria looked at this young man with his computer and his impossible promises, remembering Doña Carmen's warning about finding another way. She thought about the empty jewelry box, her children's hungry faces, and the mountain of bills that grew taller each day. What did she have left to lose, except the very last pieces of her pride? "Show me," she said, and opened the door to a future she couldn't yet imagine. Alex's laptop screen glowed in the dim kitchen light as he pulled up charts that looked like mountain ranges painted in green and red. Numbers danced across the screen in ways that made Maria's head spin, but she forced herself to focus. Sophia sat beside her, translating not just words, but concepts that seemed to exist in a world beyond their daily struggle for rent money and grocery bills. "Bitcoin is like digital gold," Alex explained, his hands moving as he spoke, painting pictures in the air that Maria tried to capture with her mind. "But better than gold, because no one can take it from you if you know how to protect it. See this?" He pointed to a line on the screen that looked like a roller coaster designed by someone having a nightmare. "This shows how the price has moved over the past year, from $1,000 to almost $4,000. Maria stared at the screen, trying to understand how numbers on a computer could represent real money. But how can money exist if you can't touch it? If there's no paper, no coin? "The same way your ATM card works, Mummy," Sophia said, her young voice carrying the confidence of a generation that had grown up with technology. "The money isn't really in the card, it's in the computer system. Bitcoin is like that, but no bank controls it." Alex nodded, pulling up another screen that showed what looked like a digital wallet. "Think of it this way, Mrs. Vasquez. When you sold your grandmother's ring, Doña Carmen could only give you what she thought she could sell it for, minus her profit. But if you had bought Bitcoin with that money instead of paying bills, today it would be worth over $400. The number hit Maria like a physical blow. $400. More than double what she had received for a ring that held a century of family history. She thought about the pearl earrings, the silver watch, all the pieces of her heritage transformed into temporary solutions, while this invisible money grew like seeds in digital soil. But what if the computer breaks? What if the electricity goes out? What if the government says no? The questions tumbled out of her mouth, each one representing a fear born from a lifetime of learning that anything good could be taken away without warning. Alex's expression grew serious, and he reached into his pocket to pull out what looked like a small metal device. "This is a hardware wallet. But more importantly, Bitcoin lives in something called the blockchain. Even if every computer in the world broke tomorrow, as long as someone, somewhere remembered the system, it could be rebuilt. And the government? He paused, looking directly into Maria's eyes. They tried to ban it in China. The price went up. They tried to regulate it in India. The price went up because Bitcoin doesn't live in any one country. It lives everywhere and nowhere. Father Miguel, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. Maria, I know this sounds like something from a science fiction movie, but I've watched Alex teach the Gonzalez family. Roberto was about to lose his restaurant. Now he processes payments in Bitcoin and saves money every month that the banks can't touch. Maria felt something stirring in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in so long she had forgotten its name. Possibility. But possibility was dangerous. Possibility could lead to hope, and hope could lead to devastation when reality came crashing down. How much money do you need to start? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Any amount. $10, $50, whatever you can afford to lose. Alex's honesty struck her as refreshing after months of dealing with landlords and bill collectors who promised everything and delivered nothing. But Mrs. Vásquez, never invest more than you can afford to lose completely. This isn't a magic solution. It's a tool, and like any tool, it only works if you understand how to use it. Maria looked at her daughter's hopeful face, at Father Miguel's encouraging nod, at Alex's patient expression. In her purse sat $53, grocery money that would buy maybe 4 days of food for her family. $53 that represented the difference between eating and not eating, between keeping the lights on and sitting in darkness. But it also represented something else, the possibility of never having to sell another piece of her family's soul. 6 months later, Maria stared at Alex's laptop screen in disbelief, her hands shaking as she read the numbers that seemed too impossible to be real. The $53 she had invested in Bitcoin when it was trading at $3,800 had become $530. The digital wallet on the screen showed 0.01394 Bitcoin, a number that had felt meaningless when Alex first explained it, but now represented more money than she had ever held at one time in her life. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. How can numbers on a screen become so much money? Alex smiled, but his expression carried a new weight of responsibility. Over the past months, he had become more than a teacher to Maria's family. He had become their bridge to a world where money could grow instead of just disappear, where hope had mathematical backing. The same way your grandmother's ring had value, Mrs. Vásquez. People believe it's worth something, so it becomes worth something. But unlike gold, Bitcoin can be sent anywhere in the world in minutes, can't be counterfeited, and can't be seized unless someone has your private keys. Sophia, now 13 and fluent in both the language of poverty and the vocabulary of cryptocurrency, peered over her mother's shoulder. Mommy, this means we can pay the rent for 3 months, maybe 4, if we're careful. But Maria found herself thinking beyond rent, beyond the immediate crisis that had defined every decision for the past 2 years. For the first time since her husband's death, she was thinking about the future instead of just survival. The sensation was so foreign, it almost felt like fear. What if it goes down? She asked, voicing the terror that had kept her awake for weeks, as she watched the price fluctuate like a fever chart. What if tomorrow it's worth nothing? Then you lose what you invested, just like if you had bought lottery tickets or put it in a bank that failed, Alex replied honestly. But Mrs. Vásquez, look around the world. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Lebanon. What happened to people who kept their money in banks when their governments printed too much currency? Their life savings became worthless paper. At least Bitcoin can cross borders. The words hit Maria with sudden clarity. She thought about her grandmother's stories of the revolution, how paper money had become kindling overnight, how families who had buried gold in the desert were the only ones who survived. But this wasn't about burying treasure. This was about carrying wealth in her memory, in 24 words that could recreate her financial future anywhere in the world. The euphoria was interrupted by the sharp sound of boots in the hallway, followed by aggressive knocking that made all three of them freeze. Through the thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice, but it wasn't alone. There were other voices, official voices, speaking the clipped English of government authority. "Immigration raid," Sophia whispered, her face pale with the terror that had haunted their community for months. "Mummy, they're checking apartments." Maria's mind raced through possibilities like cards shuffling in a desperate hand. They could hide, but where? They could run, but to where? They could fight, but with what? Then Alex's voice cut through the panic with an urgency that surprised her. "Mrs. Vasquez, quick! Do you remember the 12 words I taught you, the ones for your wallet recovery?" Yes, I think so." Her mind struggled to focus as the voices grew closer, as reality collapsed around the fragile sanctuary of her kitchen. "If something happens, if they take you, if you have to leave everything behind, those 12 words are your family's entire future. Not the ring, not the earrings, not anything they can see or touch, just those words in your memory." As the knocking reached their door, Maria closed her eyes and repeated the 12 words that had become more precious than any jewelry her family had ever owned. 12 words that represented not just money, but the possibility of dignity, independence, and hope that could travel across any border, survive any government, and grow like seeds planted in the infinite soil of human innovation. 2 years later, María Elena Vásquez stood before a room full of nervous faces in the basement of St. Joseph's Church, holding a smartphone that had become her most powerful tool for liberation. The immigration raid that had terrorized their neighborhood had passed them by, but it had changed everything. Maria had realized that financial independence wasn't just about personal survival. It was about community resilience. "Buenos días, hermanas y hermanos," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had transformed from victim to teacher. "My name is María Elena, and I want to tell you about the treasure that no government can steal, no bank can freeze, and no landlord can demand." In the audience sat women like she had been. Rosa, whose husband had been deported, leaving her with 4 children. Carmen, who cleaned office buildings for 12 hours a day but still couldn't afford her daughter's college tuition. Miguel, whose construction wages disappeared into money transfer fees every time he sent support to his family in Honduras. Alex sat in the back row, no longer the nervous young man who had knocked on her door, but a confident teacher who had helped dozens of families discover financial sovereignty. Sophia, now 15 and fluent in 3 languages, Spanish, English, and the universal language of cryptocurrency, helped translate complex concepts into simple truths. "When I started," Maria continued, holding up her phone, "I had $53 and a lot of fear. Today that investment has become $8,000. But more importantly, I sleep at night knowing that my children's future doesn't depend on any government's permission or any bank's goodwill." She told them about the 12 words that had saved her family, about learning to think in terms of satoshis instead of dollars, about discovering that wealth could be created and preserved without the permission of institutions that had never served people like them. She showed them the wallet on her phone, the numbers that represented not just money but freedom, dignity, and the power to help others. "But this isn't about getting rich quick," Maria emphasized, remembering Alex's warnings and her own painful lessons. "This is about building something that belongs to us, that travels with us, that grows while we sleep. Some weeks the price goes up, some weeks it goes down. But over time, if you're patient, if you're smart, if you only invest what you can afford to lose, this can change everything." Rosa raised her hand tentatively. "But what if ICE comes? What if they take our phones?" Maria smiled, touching her heart. "They can take our phones, our apartments, even our papers, but they can't take what's in here. 12 words, memorized like a prayer, can recreate our entire financial future anywhere in the world. This is bigger than borders, stronger than governments." As the meeting continued, Maria watched faces transform from skepticism to understanding to hope. She saw herself 2 years ago in every worried expression, every cautious question, every moment when someone realized that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. After the meeting, as families filled out paperwork to open their first digital wallets, Alex approached her with a grin. "You know, Mrs. Vasquez, you've become quite the revolutionary." Maria laughed, thinking about her grandmother who had survived the Mexican Revolution with nothing but gold hidden in her clothes. "No, Alex, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm just a woman who learned that the most powerful weapon against poverty isn't a gun or a protest. It's knowledge. And knowledge, unlike gold, multiplies when you share it." Outside St. Joseph's Church, the desert wind carried the sounds of a community discovering that their greatest treasure wasn't buried in the past, but encrypted in the future, waiting to be unlocked by 12 simple words, and the courage to believe that technology could serve justice, that innovation could heal inequality, and that sometimes the most radical act of resistance was simply refusing to remain powerless. The jewelry was gone, sold piece by piece to survive another day. But in its place, Maria had found something infinitely more valuable, a treasure that grew stronger every time she shared it, a wealth that multiplied through wisdom, and a legacy that no government could ever confiscate.